challengers! Ultra Street Fighter 2! The final challengers!
Now you see what they did there? This game is so great he had to announce the title twice. That's just brilliant. Once upon a time there was a game called Street Fighter 2. It was wonderful, it was classic, it was fun. Then Capcom made more Street Fighter 2 games. And kept making 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 more Street Fighter 2 games. And then it became a running joke that if the world were to come to an end, two things would survive the apocalypse: TNA Impact Wrestling and the Capcom division responsible for producing new versions of Street Fighter 2. But I digress. So Ultra Street Fighter 2, at the time of recording, a Nintendo Switch exclusive released in 2017, is the, as of this moment, latest edition of Street Fighter 2, where they changed some bits here and there, as well as add in 2 new characters. Except they really didn't. They just took 2 pre-existing characters, changed their colors, edited their profile pictures a bit, and altered their movesets somewhat to fool people into thinking these are quote-unquote new characters. Not to mention, Evil Ryu, for whatever reason, is a thing that continues to exist ever since his inception in Street Fighter Alpha 2, while Violent Ken was a thing in that SVC Chaos game that stemmed from a plot point in the kick-ass Street Fighter 2 animated movie from a couple decades ago. So, I think it's 20 years old? Really? Oh, and somewhere along the way they added in Shinokuma, who's just Akuma but shinier. Yeah, that's all I got. But I digress. This is a newer version of Street Fighter 2 which gives you 2 styles of presentation. Either the classic CPS2 arcade graphics and soundtrack, displayed in a traditional 4:3 aspect ratio and tiny sprites, or the high-definition 16:9 visuals from the HD remix game from a decade prior, complemented with not only a new collection of remixed tunes but also new voice acting, presumably taken from some of the more recent games, I suppose. Personally though, while I'm not a huge fan of the newly remixed tunes save for a couple exceptions, I do appreciate the effort in giving these characters new voices to complement the decade-old redrawn sprites, which, yeah, I'll get back to this. So how does the game play? It plays like Street Fighter 2. I don't know what else you want me to tell you. You've got 6 buttons, the standard stock setup. You could pick from 17 characters and a couple variants. Variety of special moves you could execute with specific joystick and button combinations. You have a single super combo that you could execute when your super meter is full, and you knock the other fellow down by draining their health. Pretty straightforward fare, I think. It's pretty much the same Street Fighter 2 at its core, with some rebalanced bit, and there's also a new technical bit where you can escape throw attempts, which is something recent, I think. So that's something. Now, digging a bit deeper, it plays fine. Ultra does introduce some slight tweaks to the overall balance of the game that makes the gameplay better or worse, depending on your point of view, I suppose. I'll leave the finer details to those who care for such minutia, but for the most part, it plays about as well as any Street Fighter 2 game that has been out since the dawn of time. And they made a fine point to keep it that way. They didn't introduce EX moves or alpha counters or parries or guard breaks or slam master moves that would get introduced into Street Fighter lore once Capcom learned what number came after 2, nor did they try to turn it into some modern fighting game thing. This is for all intents and purposes a game that was made in 1991, updated enough to be somewhat playable by today's standards, but still plays like that initial release. Or at least the Super Turbo release, which was the most recent old thing and stuff. And yeah, whatever. One notable tweak to Ultra Street Fighter 2 is the difficulty of the CPU opponents. The CPU in Super Turbo was a motherfucker to such a degree that even the easiest setting would give you a hard time. Ultra Street Fighter 2 tweaks the difficulty of the CPU in the opposite direction and made everything easier to such a degree that I could actually win a couple fights in the hardest skill level, which is not something I could normally claim. I mean, I'm no pro gamer, thank fuck for that. I just fiddle around with this stuff, but when normal difficulty ends up being a walk in the park, when in past Street Fighter 2s the level would provide you with a bit of a struggle at least, especially during the last leg of the arcade mode, I don't know. I suppose I should be glad it isn't super turbo hard, but still, I don't know. It's something I noticed. I guess, I suppose. Does anybody really care? I guess not. Aside from the main arcade mode, there's a buddy battle mode, which is reminiscent of the old dramatic battle mode from the old Alpha games, where you pick a team of 2 fighters to face off against the likes of Violent Ken, Evil Ryu, M. Bison, and Akuma in 2-on-1 handicap matches, where the team shares the same health bar, but have their own unique super meters. It's a thing you could do, and the second player can control the partner for more fun. You could also go online and find people to fight. I had no success with this, so I didn't bother. And you could create your own color palettes, which is fine for a lark, but doesn't quite reach the crazy details you could do in other older games that also had this feature. And of course, there's your usual versus and training modes to complement the rest of the stuff. There's also a gallery mode. And there's a game manual, so if you want to know how to play the game, you could check out the manual. Which is nice, because there's no paper instructions in this thing anymore, and, well, you know, whatever. Fuck, man. Whatever. And then there's Way of the Hadou, a bonus game of sorts where you use the Joy-Con motion controls to perform Ryu's signature moves to take down a bunch of Shadowloo grunts and eventually Bison himself. A lot of people tend to shit on this mode because the motion controls tend to be a bit spotty, and well, at first it seems to be the case. This applies mainly to the default casual mode, but there's also a technical level where you can control the sensitivity that I find makes the game a bit more tolerable, even if it's still not quite perfect. With this in mind, it's a nice little diversion and provides the game with some Street Fighter 4-esque visuals for you to enjoy before it eventually loses its charm. But hey, I don't know, I had fun with this one, and present it as a mini-game bonus of a larger package rather than, say, its own individual release is probably the best thing to happen to it. If this were 10 years ago and this was a standalone release for the Wii, then it would deserve the shellacking people gave it, but it's just a thing to fill space on a cart and not even the main attraction, so this is all the attention I'm gonna give it here, so yeah. So graphically speaking, Ultra Street Fighter 2 is a mileage-varying game. As stated, the game offers 2 visual styles, the Udon Illustrated HD Remix graphics, which look a touch brighter than they did in HD Remix, but otherwise maintains the same high-definition art style that looks fairly decent and animates poorly due to everything being traced over the old graphical assets so as to not mess with timing and stuff. And you also have the classic graphics, which makes the game look like the old CPS2 based graphics that most people would prefer and actually praise over the HD stuff. And it's alright, I guess. The border kills it for me though, and for some reason, something feels off with these classic graphics whenever I play them. Maybe it's the colors for the sprites, maybe the background seems somewhat faded, I don't know. I found Super Turbo off the 30th Anniversary Collection translated somewhat better to HD than Ultra's classic sprites. Maybe it's something minor that nobody else will notice or even care about, and if that's the case, it's no biggie. Still looks adequate. At the very least, it's not HD Remix's attempt at classic graphics. Good lord, what in the blue hell is this pile of shit? On the flip side of things, the audio is perfectly fine, I suppose. As mentioned, in 2 sets of audio, the classic CPS2 based audio from the old Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo game, with the old music, the old voice bites and whatnots, and that fares a bit better than the classic graphics, I think. It's classic, it still sounds good, and while I personally prefer the old CPS1 tracks, this ain't too bad either. And also you have new remixes of the classic tracks, which are okay in some regards, not so much in others. There's some recycled bits from the HD Remix game for the intermissions and the endings and whatnots, and there are new voice bites, which I assume are all recycled bits from previous Street Fighter games, but maybe they're all new, I don't know, I don't particularly care to be honest. They sound alright, and if you want spiffy new audio to go along with the somewhat less spiffy new graphics, they complement each other well enough, I suppose. Overall, Ultra Street Fighter 2, the final challenges for Nintendo Switch, is a thing that happened and it works. Whether you think it's a much needed update, or a throwaway thing that's a waste of money, or you just don't care, the bottom line is that this is a perfectly fine version of Street Fighter 2 that has a couple extra bells and whistles while still retaining that fun, solid gameplay. Is it worth getting nowadays, especially with that 30th anniversary collection on the same system, for roughly the same price, about 40 to 50 bucks, which is probably the main sticking point for most folks in regards to purchasing this game. Ultimately, your mileage is going to vary on that count undoubtedly, but it is the most recent version of SF2 until the next one comes along. It's probably the closest thing to an HD remix-like port on the go if you care for that sort of thing. And you know what? Fuck it. It's Street Fighter 2, it's classic, it's timeless, it's fun. I got my money's worth. The end. I'm going to bed. Good night.